Hello, and welcome to my very first album review, where I'll be reviewing Drammatica, the very best of Yoko Shimomura. I won't have too much prelude to avoid dating this video too much, but this is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally getting around to giving it a try. Of course, there are melons and others who review popular music, but I want there to be reviews of music that doesn't often get that type of publicity, but deserves it nonetheless. I have decided that in terms of format, I should review the album on a track-by-track basis, as well as the overall listening experience. Aspects I will pay especially close attention to include, but are not limited to, compositional quality, orchestration/arrangement, and recording quality. Then, with all that taken into consideration, I'll also consider how the album flows and what type of story it could be telling. This is an exploratory exercise, so I encourage feedback on this especially, as it may enhance my enjoyment of the album. So now, let's get to the album itself. Drammatica, the very best of Yoko Shimomura, is perhaps my favorite album of all time, since childhood. I always thought that the title sounded a bit posthumous, but thankfully it is not. Yoko Shimomura continues to make great music. But in 2008, there came the release of an orchestral arrangement album that would seek to compile the best of her works into one epic 60-minute collection. Admittedly, the definition of best probably suffers from a fair deal of recency bias, since a number of the tracks featured on the album probably would not have been included had this been made in a vacuum, though they are still great selections, which speaks to Shimomura's skill. Nonetheless, how do the selections that made it onto the album hold up? How did Shimomura, Kamaoka, Wada, and co. fare at bringing these video game OSTs to an orchestral setting? Let's see. Legend of Mana title theme. This is a sensible way to start the album. Being the title theme for a game, it naturally lends itself to the role of an opener. In particular, this theme is very beautiful, but also tantalizingly dramatic, in a way that you would expect the opening of an album entitled Drammatica to be. The original arrangement of this theme was already quite good, but the Drammatica version augments it by bringing in pieces of Holy Power of Mana, giving it a bit more intrigue and room to breathe. If the original intro theme feels a bit like a teaser, this feels like the full piece of music it was meant to be. It even gives it a proper ending rather than a fade-out, which is something I find myself sorely missing whenever I listen to the original soundtrack. In terms of sound, the orchestration is lush and full and comes across beautifully. The timpani, brass, and violins are especially used to great effect as tools for creating dramatic tension, and the piano, found in so much of Shimomura's music, leads us in and out of the track with a soothing yet eerie feeling that leaves you wondering. This is a piece of music that takes you on a journey, and it doesn't take more than about 3 minutes to do so. It's a paragon of musical storytelling that can teach by example. This is the definitive version of this piece, and it gets this album off to a good start. Take the Offensive. This theme from Front Mission is very aptly named. It bursts onto the scene and doesn't start to let up until about a minute or so, where it strips back the layers of the orchestration before exploding again into the climactic finale. It's notably in a different key from the original, which in my head always feels like the correct key since this was the version I heard first. It's not especially important, but it's one of the many comparison points. Some of my favorite features of this orchestration include the chromatic violin runs that create dissonance, the brass that sounds bright and militant, and the snare that carries the frenetic rhythm through the exciting sections. Then in contrast to that, you have the gentler sections where the woodwinds take over, and it feels like the music is fighting to restore conflict in a peaceful place, where again that snare picks up and beckons you back into the strife. It's really cool. Overall, a very solid track, and fun to listen to. Destati. Awaken is the meaning of this track's Italian title, and it hits you on the head with its aggressive opening. This is the first of 2 times on the album where we'll hear lyrics, these being in Italian like the title. The original Destati was the first piece of music composed for the Kingdom Hearts series, but it only got used in the trailer originally, not actually appearing in the game, though it is heavily referenced in pieces such as Dive into the Heart, Destati, obvious, and Guardando nel buio. This is one of my favorite compositions, but perhaps controversially, I sort of prefer the original to this version. Not by a lot, and not totally, but it's been my preference for a few years now. I think this version leans a bit unnecessarily far into bombast and loses some of the mystique of the original, and is also a bit fatiguing to listen to at this point in the album. For example, at 3 minutes 20 seconds into the song, either Shimomura or Kameoka opts to add a modulation and repeat the finale in a different key. I find this addition just a little trite and not really beneficial to the narrative of the song, especially as it omits the reprieve that is present at the end of the original track, which I find to be one of the things that keeps me coming back to listen to the original song over this version. It's just a bit more intriguing, and gives a totally different sensibility to the end of the track than pure, unadulterated darkness. But let's be fair, this is still a great track, despite my preferences. And though not all the arranging choices are my favorite, they are done intelligently and deliberately, and it is still, after all, very exciting to listen to. This track, like the others so far, has a great deal of contrast and doesn't just beat you over the head from start to finish. The story of this track can be deciphered by reading the lyrics. I'll throw them up on screen along with their English translations. The composition does a great job of telling this story, even if you don't understand Italian. Overall, a great song. Hometown Domina. Finally, this is the first track on the album that feels totally at peace. Very little conflict to be found here, and yet it's not simply a stereotypical C major affair. It's written in G-flat minor and modulates to G minor by the end, once again proving that minor does not equal sad. This is such a fun and light piece of music, and it's arranged beautifully here. It incorporates the theme from A Soulful Place to fill out its midsection, and does so seamlessly you'd be tricked into thinking they were always meant to be one piece of music. As a child, I never suspected that this was some sort of medley, only learning that later on when I actually listened to the Legend of Mana soundtrack. This track demonstrates one of Shimomura's recognized talents, the ability to create feelings of nostalgia and warmth from seemingly thin air. She does this in many of her works, and this example, originally from 1999, is one of her finest. This orchestration is of course beautiful, however, if I could give a slight critique, I would say more use of vibrato could do even more to affect the listener, especially in the midsection. But that is truly nitpicking. This piece feels like a wide smile from someone you love. The bird flies in the sky, the fish swims in the river. This piece takes what is a simple yet effective source material and expands it slightly to be something a bit more fit to be on an album of this type. It's not the most impressive piece on offer here, but it is quite catchy. Similar to Take the Offensive, it opts to change the key from the original incarnation, perhaps to better suit the very Western-style orchestra, as opposed to the instrumental choices of the original that could be described as Eastern. You can hear this Eastern sound in the structure of the composition itself, mostly in the repeating motifs and the shape of the melody. As a child, I always thought the piece had that sound to it, even before hearing the original, which makes it more obvious. Yoko Shimomura, being a Japanese composer, perhaps makes this choice appear mundane, but her style usually favors Western classical music. She's gone as far as to say Chopin is her greatest inspiration, so this is an interesting departure from form. I'm no expert in Eastern styles of music, so I'm not one to judge the usage of style here, but I can certainly say I like it. It's a fun, simple tune, and at 2 minutes 18 seconds it doesn't overstay its welcome. It might have been interesting to hear this be done with the instrumentation more faithful to the original, but that's just not what this album is about. To the Heroes of Old, opening theme from Heroes of Mana. This is one of those tracks on the album that arguably made the cut in part due to recency bias. Heroes of Mana had come out just the year prior to the release of this album, and besides the odd flourish here and there, this is not the most transformative track on the album. It follows the original more or less beat for beat, but it differentiates itself in the ways of instrumentation and a bit in interpretation. The original theme from Heroes of Mana does what it can to create a large feeling using Nintendo DS sounds, but obviously is outstripped by the power of a symphony orchestra. In the Drammatica version, you can appreciate a lot more of the timbre of the different instruments, and how the instrumental choices create different meanings within the music. Adding to this point, There's much more use of brass in the leading lines. This gives the piece a more militant outlook and increases variety. This is pretty fundamental stuff, and it's kind of adjustments you expect. But since this one is quite similar musically, I figured I should focus more on its sonic qualities. On interpretation, this track has more of a natural flow to it, feeling less metronomic than the original, especially at the climax where the beats are elongated in a very expressive way, rather than counted strictly on 3. These changes work together to make this already good piece of music into something that feels less stilted and more cohesive. Twinkle Twinkle Holidays. This track comes a bit out of left field, being a medley of Happy Holidays from Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix and Neverland Sky from Kingdom Hearts. I cannot ascertain any discernible reason for interconnecting these pieces of music. They are ostensibly not related in any way, but it's a nice sounding medley nonetheless. And though Neverland Sky doesn't originally have anything to do with Christmas or winter, the vibe does nonetheless carry through. Again, I would say this inclusion is partly due to recency bias, as 2FM had come out the year prior. And once again, it's not bad by any means. I just doubt it would have been chosen if the album was made, say, 5 years later. Overall, I think this track is really neat and sweet sounding. The themes selected, though unrelated, come together and create something that is pleasant and heartwarming. To offer critique, this certainly feels like the least deliberate of all the tracks on the album. Almost a bit of filler, but it's enjoyable filler at least. Tango Appassionata, The Way This Heart Is. Coming in at the midpoint of this album, this track is
a surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
And a masterpiece. By this point, Drammatica begins to feel a bit stagnant and predictable, having played it safe for the last 3 tracks. Mind you, it's an incredibly high standard of stagnation, but the point stands. But if at any point since Destati you felt this album putting you to sleep, this will certainly be the one to wake you. It all starts with the choice of theme from Heroes of Mana. The Way This Heart Is one of Shimomura's very best and most idiosyncratic battle themes, utilizing an alternating 5-4-6-8 time signature. It's the most rhythmically rich selection on the album, and the arrangement here reinterprets it as less of a battle and more of a dance, hence the amendment to the title. It's slow and methodical, bringing out every detail of the original, while also creating its own quirks. The instrumentation is also essential to this arrangement, carrying over much of the symphonic sound of the original, but opting to include the accordion. This instrument is a beautiful addition and gives a completely different energy to this version of the piece. Shimomura's signature piano also takes more of a back seat, anchoring the chords rather than being a part of the leading motif. All of these changes contribute to this orchestration's more laid-back, somber feeling. The phases this theme undergoes feel like an expression of life and death. It feels like it's teetering on the edge. You can bite through the drama. It's almost sexy. There's only so much I can say without gushing about every single thing, so go listen to it if you haven't already. It's a major standout. Colored Earth. This is an orchestration of a standout piece from Seiken Densetsu, Legend of Mana. This orchestration doesn't differentiate itself too much stylistically from the original. However, like most tracks on this album, it has a more tutti or full orchestra sound, taking what would have been handled by relatively few instrumental sound fonts and spreading it over a wide range of symphonic instruments. It also takes the time to strip all of that away in the midsection, exploring some rather unexpected variations to this piece, before a string arrangement of the main theme, which then goes back to full orchestra, through to the largo finale. Like the previous track, this one has a lot to offer rhythmically, being in 6/8. It creates a great sense of action and energy through its use of percussion, and the dynamics in this orchestration reveal layers to this piece that could not be expressed in the original. This is a strong piece from the album. It does the simple things right, adding texture, contrast, variety, and narrative to its originally less complex incarnation. It's quite fundamental in its approach, ticking all the boxes in a satisfying way. Live Alive, Forgotten Wings. This is one of my personal favorite tracks on the album, having a rich and vibrant narrative arc, building tension through the variation of a simple motif, and finally resolving it in a way that releases that tension. I would give this track so much credit, were it not for the fact that it is almost one-to-one with the original arrangement found on the Live Alive Perfect Strategy Guidebook Limited Edition Mini CD, which was included as one of 2 bonus tracks, this one being based on the in-game track Wings That Don't Reach. And it is an excellent arrangement, so it's not exactly unfortunate that this one didn't try much of anything new, because what's great in 94 is still great in 08. I just can't give much credit to the Drammatica version of this track, as it serves as more of a glorified remaster than a new and improved orchestration. One notable addition, however, the tubular bells or chimes in the beginning create a nice lead-in for what could be considered a bit of an abrupt start. And hey, it's a really good remaster. I generally prefer listening to it over the original. Like the rest of the album, it is lush and lavish and has a depth of dynamics that the sound font of the original could never achieve. I think the purpose of an orchestration like this is not to explore new dimensions of an old work, but more so to bring more exposure to a pretty obscure piece that was already good enough for Showtime. So it's not exactly transformative, but it is beautiful. The 13th Anthology. This is an epic medley of 6 themes from the Kingdom Hearts series, all associated with Organization 13 that share the same leitmotif, originally from the special secret movie Another Side, Another Story, Deep Dive, from Kingdom Hearts Final Mix. It includes the themes in order: Another Side, the 13th Struggle, the 13th Reflection, Graceful Assassin, the 13th Dilemma, Lord of the Castle, and culminates in a reprise of Another Side. I think it would be superfluous to go over every piece of this medley individually, but all the individual pieces serve as great symphonic reimaginings of these boss themes, which, if we remember, at the time, had only ever been rendered by the PS2 sound card. So though we may take the HD remastered for granted today, at the time this was pretty groundbreaking. The orchestration of Lord of the Castle especially stands out for its monumental gravity and scale. It's somewhat of an odd choice for a climax from a lore perspective, making Marluxia seem to hold more importance than he really does in the organization, but musically it works so well as the conclusion to this theme's illustrious life in the Kingdom Hearts series. Of course, Organization 13's Another Side motif would go on to appear numerous times in the Kingdom Hearts series' future, but most of that wasn't particularly planned from as early as 2008. So in context, this piece would have been the end-all, be-all Organization 13 theme, and it sure does feel like it. Manifold Irons. This orchestration of the battle theme from Front Mission chooses to slow things down to savor every beat of this thrilling piece, still keeping the pulsing rhythm throughout, all the way up until the end where it takes an even slower turn and seems to bring out this sort of tragedy that isn't present in the original piece. I'm not familiar with the story of Front Mission, but I can imagine from the premise it's not exactly a frolic through the fields, so pulling that element out of this piece feels fitting. Speaking about the premise, it is clear that Front Mission is about war, and this piece smacks of it. The original had plenty to begin with, but this version punches it up several times, especially the section starting at 1 minute and 35 seconds. It's aggressive and bombastic and feels like a series of bombs going off, with the thumping percussion and the staccato articulations from the brass. I still get a chill down my spine whenever I hear it, and if I was sitting, I suddenly get the urge to stand up and punch something. I didn't know it before, but writing this review has made me realize that this is one of my absolute favorite tracks from the album. And as a bonus, the substantial retard at the end helps this track to lead beautifully into the next. Ruined Sparkling City, aka City of Flickering Destruction. This piece is overwhelmingly tragic, to an exaggerated extent. It's melodramatic and murky and sad. It beats you over the head with how damn sad it is. In some ways, it reminds me of the theme from Schindler's List, if that's not too impertinent to say. Both pieces center around a simple motif, repeating and intensifying until it becomes unbearable, so to speak, with some slight variations along the way. The repetition is not a shortcoming, rather it is used deliberately to demand the sympathy of the listener. I like music like this, that makes no apologies about being plainly depressing and doesn't try to make any suggestions to the contrary. Contrast isn't always necessary. This album has a lot of it, so this feels unique because of its unflinching presentation of pain, loss, and defeat. I also think this is perhaps one of the most profound statements the album attempts to make. If the previous track is about war, and this one is about tragedy and loss, then the combination of the two tracks could be a way of expressing the horrors of war. I know it might be a stretch to draw these types of connections for a compilation album such as this, but in my years of listening to it, it tends to come to the front of my mind, so regardless of intention, it is my interpretation. Now, with a little critical thinking, you could call that shallow as far as a statement goes, but again, for this type of work, that's more depth than I would ever expect, so I give it a little extra credit. The Other Promise. By far the most talked about and lauded piece on this entire album, and even going beyond that, being Shimomura's most preeminent piece in the eyes of many. It is difficult to approach a review of this work without an exceptional amount of baggage attached, but I will try. I'm biased, being much more of a Kingdom Hearts fan than a fan of any other series featured on this album, so I can't help but do a little retrospective. The Other Promise was originally a piece of music from Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. Being based on the theme Roxas from the original game, it served as the battle theme for the added fight between Roxas and Sora near the end of the game, as well as the subsequent data battle. I think part of this theme's fame started with how it was introduced to Kingdom Hearts fans, in the form of an exclusive Japan-only re-release of the game. Something about that exclusivity had international fans pining to experience what we knew we couldn't have without a great deal of effort and money. This gave content exclusive to the Final Mix release a mystique and an almost otherworldly aura, like an alternate universe version of the game with more stuff. This extended to the Lingering Will battle, the Cavern of Remembrances, the secret movie, and of course, the battle with Roxas. Had 2FM been delivered as an international release from day one, I doubt it would have had the buzz that it had for years until the release of Kingdom Hearts 2.5 finally localized it. The next piece of the puzzle is the theme itself. It's based on Roxas's original character theme, but is transformed into something far greater, becoming both more exciting and more heartbreaking. That heartbreak is obviously important too. Fans connected with Roxas emotionally, probably more than Nomura and Co imagined they would. And it was such a cruel twist to turn his character theme into a theme for a battle in which the player is supposed to defeat him. It feels neither victorious nor sinister. There's nothing to celebrate here. You're not meant to take pleasure in defeating Roxas. You're meant to pity him, and even to grieve him. Of course, Roxas lives in the end, but we don't know that at this point in the story. The final piece of how this theme rose to the top of Shimomura's discography is simply how Square Enix pushed it, capitalizing on its popularity. It's on this album, as well as Kingdom Hearts Piano Collections, which came out around the same time, and never mind the in-game track's popularity, those two versions took on a life of their own as standalone pieces of music, and the theme has been a hot topic of discussion ever since. This Drammatica arrangement, then, is the ultimate culmination of this piece of music, in my opinion, and is yet to be topped by any to this day. It takes after the in-game original, but goes on to build even more, and to tell us more about the tortured character that is Roxas. To call it beautiful would be simplistic, but I can't think of a much better word for it. And I know the last track was tragic, but that was a very wide-scale type of tragedy. It represented a civilization in ruin. This is so obviously personal in a way that's hard to describe. And while the orchestration is grandiose beyond the in-game version, it's still very tasteful and doesn't go so far as to feel like a parody of itself. Whereas Destati, for example, in my opinion overextends itself with bombast, this feels as if a story has finally been told in full for the first time, and it's given all the respect it deserves. Given my glowing review then, you might expect this to be my runaway favorite from the album. And it's really not. But I appreciate it so much for what it is. The Tale Told by the Wind, ending theme from Heroes of Mana. A breath of fresh air, exactly what was needed after all that doom and gloom from the last however many tracks. I find it amazing how much this piece of music brightens my mood immediately after hearing all those whoppers prior. It's a pretty simple piece, constructed using theme and variation, as well as a very nice B section to give a reprieve from the main theme before the finale. and it's so nicely orchestrated that you don't particularly notice the repetition unless you pay very close attention. The use of dynamics is also lovely and keeps the main theme from feeling stagnant. The way this orchestration hones in on different sections of the orchestra and allows them to shine is also enjoyable. This might honestly be my second favorite track on the album. It's just so damn cheerful and light. However, very similar to Forgotten Wings, I can't give most of the credit to Drammatica, because this version is simply not that distinct from the original. Credit is due the orchestration. I'm not saying getting what's on a game card to come across in a real symphony orchestra is easy, but most of the other pieces on this album have to tackle the same challenge, and a lot of them do a lot more than just that. So for that reason, I don't give these tracks quite as much credit as those others. Despite that critique, the similarity doesn't do anything to spoil my enjoyment of this track. It's shimmering and lively and wonderful, and comes in at just the right time. This would have been an adequate closer to the album, were it not for Somnus. I remember a time when there was an in-development video game entitled Final Fantasy Versus 13, and it was represented almost singularly by this theme. I don't think it's an exaggeration in the slightest to say that this theme carried much of the hype for this long-awaited, increasingly delayed game that ultimately never was. There's a whole world that's implied through this single 2-minute 30-second piece of music, in part from the lyrics written by Tetsuya Nomura and later translated to Latin, and in part due to how majestic it is. The orchestration is mesmerizing, the harmonies are gorgeous, the string arrangement is so detailed and multi-layered. I particularly love the cello counter-melody that leads into the tutti section. This feels even more prominent in the instrumental version of Somnus that would debut years later in Final Fantasy XV. One piece of this track that I see getting next to no recognition for reasons I cannot understand is the vocal powerhouse that is Andrea Hopkins. She has ruined any prospective covers of this song for me, because nobody I've heard attempt it has the range that she has, the agility, the ferocity, and most importantly, the storytelling. It really feels like she knows what this song is about, and she's telling you, even though the listener almost certainly doesn't understand Latin, that's not the point. The point is you can understand the song without knowing what the words mean. You feel it, you connect to it, you become it. This is the song. My absolute favorite song of all time, and a mightily worthy closer to this album. Yoko Shimomura and Kaoru Wada created something truly special that I can't see being replicated, even by them. A note on production values. I've made a bit of music in my time, and I've edited some audio, so I like to think I'm pretty discerning about that type of thing, but by no means am I a connoisseur. I think, in terms of recorded orchestral music, this album is mixed and mastered relatively well. There's a good amount of stereo separation and soundstage, so you get a good sense of where everything is supposed to be in the orchestra. It's not the most 3D thing ever by any means, but it gets the job done. I think that the levels are good. Obviously nothing peaks or clips, that would just be shoddy, but also there is a level of compression to the audio that is definitely noticeable but not obnoxious. What I mean by that is, oftentimes, recordings of classical music have a huge amount of dynamics because they're trying to give the listener a truthful representation of how soft and loud an orchestra can really be. For an example of this, listen to Hilary Hahn playing Sibelius's violin concerto. It goes from really, really soft at certain times to really, really loud at others. Drammatica is not like that. There's enough dynamics present for you to appreciate the interpretation of the orchestrator, but not so much that you feel as if you have to strain to hear some parts and cover your ears for others. It's not going for absolute naturalism. You could say it's sort of impressionistic. This probably displeases purists or audiophiles, but I think it makes listening to the album casually much more practical than a hardcore classical work. The last thing I'll mention in this section is clarity, or the slight lack thereof. I don't know exactly what circumstances this album was recorded under besides what it says in the credits, but all of the tracks you could say sound a bit warm. Warmth isn't really a bad thing, but it might veer slightly in the direction of becoming muddy if you're not careful. While I like the way this album sounds, I think when you hear some of the arrangements that have been reused in other instances, for example, The Other Promise in Kingdom Hearts Orchestra World Tour, you realize that certain details are obscured by the mix in Drammatica, which isn't actively bothersome while listening, but it can be a little disappointing in retrospect. As for the playing, all the orchestrations and performances are done at a very high level, and there's a lot of people to credit for that, so I'll leave a link to the videogamedb.net page for this album in the description. Notably, tracks 1 through 15 are all orchestrated by Natsume Kameoka. I can't say how much of the orchestrations is her own input versus what came from Shimomura herself, as she is credited as the sole arranger on the album, but I assume Kameoka did more than simply orchestrating. Kaoru Wada is credited with orchestrating the bonus track Somnus. This one is a bit different since it's not an adaptation of an existing piece, but the original version of the piece. And all I can really say is credit where it's due. It's hard to know exactly who to thank for specific things. Again, follow the link in the description if you would like to know more about who's responsible for creating this album. In conclusion, do I like Drammatica? Well, yes. In fact, I love it. A whole lot. I expressed from the outset that it was one of my favorite albums, and I haven't changed my mind. I may have seemed quite critical for being such a big fan, but it's only my obsessing over this album for over a decade that has made me so sensitive to what might not work quite as well as it could here. I think for those who enjoy this style of music, you should easily be able to put this on and enjoy it from beginning to end, finding moments of gripping beauty and awe interspersed. One thing that I promised to discuss in the intro and haven't really done justice to is the topic of theme and throughline. And to be honest, the reason I haven't said much about it is because there isn't really much to say. In the example of Manifold Irons to City of Flickering Destruction, I personally find meaning in the coming together of these tracks, but I can't say how intentional it is, and other than that, I don't really recognize much from the album that could be considered part of a wider narrative arc. And really, that's okay. I don't expect anthology albums like this to necessarily say something. The individual pieces have their stories to tell. And by making an album like this, it brings attention to those pieces and gives them space to breathe and speak for themselves outside of their original contexts. I think that is the purpose of an album like this when done well. And done well it is.